really happened. 1865 to 1925. This is the full length documentary or documentary series, depending on kind of where you're watching this. And we're going to get into a lot of stuff that has really went mainstream in the conspiracy communities and the research communities over the past 5 to 10 years. So, if you have an understanding about the concepts of the Old World, Tartary or Tartaria, and the mud flood, we can start to discuss and understand that the historical timeline is not a representation of the actual accounting of our story backed by fact. No historian or scholar understands the concepts of Tartaria, the Old World, the mud flood, the flat earth, the mud fossils, the great fires, the giants or the giant bones, as well as many other concepts we have uncovered over the past few years. Now, this shows us that we have been taught by the people who we have labeled as the controllers. If you have an understanding of these concepts, you can identify those who just repeat the talking points and jargon that they were taught by those who hid the truth from us all. They are only liable for the version of reality that was created by the controllers to control the people and govern them in a way so that they are controlled. Was there a massive realm wide repopulation effort that took place? Was there a reset event that has been covered up? Do we live in a false reality? And how can we escape this matrix of control and false information? Now, if you're familiar with some of my past work, I did a What's Really Happening video on the Second Great War or World War II. It's a full length documentary that really gets into what was really going on during World War II, focusing on Operation Paperclip, Operation High Jump, the Roswell crash, the CIA, Israel, and all of the kind of events that happened as the Second World War was wrapping up, and how those events really get us into the new world order that we're in today. So, this series will act like a prequel to that video and many other videos, focusing on our timeline and our story. Now, we see many similarities with the timeline of historical events surrounding World War I and the world we see today. First, we must acknowledge that the things we were taught are false. Why were we never taught the truth? When we look at what has been hidden, the same kind of ideas circulate within doing this research. The Old World and Tartaria, the giants of the Old World, architecture of the Old World, mystery of the giant trees, the mud flood, and the great fires. Now, as I discuss these topics in different video segments, I'm going to round that out with a summary and conclusion. We're going to get into the old world high technology a little bit, and also there will be an old world slideshow. So there's lots to this documentary series, and we're going to try to give you, the viewer or the listener, a better understanding of these topics. So, the narratives that dictate the ideas within our reality are based on the fraud and disinformation of the controllers. This is how a selective few can hold the secrets that become the key to keeping us enslaved. The controllers give you propaganda that they pass off as the truth. When you start to break down any aspect of their story, everything becomes a lie, and we can prove the deception very easily. Remember that truth is subjective to the observer. Now, if you rely on the controllers to give you your version of reality, you cannot question anything associated with their version of our story. If you begin to question reality and the controller's version of our story, you will begin to find a new story that is more factual than the stories that we were given. It's the search for truth and understanding, and then research for fact and foundation. And this is how all of this kind of works. You search the truth and you get the understanding of the controllers. You research the story we were given, you understand the facts and get at the foundational level of all of these arguments, where they all come from, and how they were created. So, one of the things that stands out to me is the mysterious Cenero Arrow Club from 1850. If you haven't seen my documentary on it, you should check it out. It does contain pieces of this puzzle that we are trying to reassemble to understand our place in this realm. The lost, highly advanced civilization and technology, and our hidden history. So I've done a documentary on the Sonora Aero Club from 1850. You can see that on my Patreon page. You can see it on Rumble, and it will kind of act sort of like a prequel to this video, giving you information of what was going on and what was documented during this 1850s time period. So it's a good one to go back and watch if you're interested. So, when getting into this research, the individual must know and understand the timeline of historical events, which is history or his story, versus the research and newly uncovered information and facts of our story. These things are for you to see, and for others, they are a test. And as we move forward, we will ask the question, what really happened? And I hope we will answer that for you, the viewer. What really happened? 1865 to 1925, the full length documentary. Our reality or our story is continuously filled with war and a small group of elites controlling the population of our realm with lies. They create a story or narrative, plan and carry out false flags which get us into these wars. Because of this, millions of people die and the rest are controlled. This is how a selective few can pull the strings and remain in control. No one ever seems to question anything. No one ever seems to ask why. Who is doing this? Are they Jewish? Are they members of a secret society? Are they Freemasons or Illuminati cult members? Are they extraterrestrials? Or is it something darker like demonic entities? When we start to ask the right questions, we are led to the answers that the general public will never accept. The information is out there for anyone to find if they know where to look and if they have the will to look. If you start to understand the ideas of the old world and the mud flood, plus the repopulation aspect of our realm, we must question all of the official stories of war. At some point in our story, civilization was at a point that the world could be taken over and transformed into the world we see and know today. Now, many will talk about bankruptcy of government and foreign monarchies, owning the people with fraudulent documents like birth certificates and social security cards. They may also talk about the capturing of flags. But this also seems like a way of holding information that most cannot conceptualize and using it against them. No matter what information is discovered, we can't seem to escape these controllers and the system that controls us. So, what really happened? The timeline of historical events, summary and decode, the first known Great Reset. Now, the end of the 19th century birthed the beginning of the 20th century. The end of this century would prepare the U.S. for many coming changes. By the end of the 1900s, America would see the end of the threats from native populations and the rise of global conflict and world wars. The true amount of native people that were killed is unknown. Anywhere from 40 million to 250 million people were killed by the invading resetters or the settlers. The native population was most likely the Tartarians or the people of Tartary. These colonizers were the controllers under and the influence of an extraterrestrial parasite we have come to know as the black goo. Now, this black goo is a advanced research topic, but it's something you should be familiar with or familiarize yourself with. I've done a full length documentary on that. So go check that out at some point to just kind of get the concepts and ideas into your mind of what this is and how it affects the people of our realm. So, after the destruction of the native cultures and the repopulation of the new inhabitants by the way of the orphan trains and the construction of the railroads would provide the infrastructure needed to frequently access deep underground facilities. Now, most likely these were constructed by the old world civilization and then repurposed for secret operations. Now, according to mainstream history, Christopher Columbus discovers America, the 13 colonies are formed, many countries attempt to colonize America, from France, Prussia, England, Spain, Holland, and many others. Expansion begins along with war with the native populations. Now, war with England occurs and our freedom is supposedly gained. Then America, as an independent nation, continues to expand its territory. Many people from all countries and nations immigrate to the U.S. Here's a map of the colonies and how slowly, every 50 years we're expanding out the territory further and further. And that's what the mainstream historians will all stick to. This is the story that was given to us, and this is the story that they go by. So many old world maps discount a lot of the claims made by historians. The people who were horse and wagon people through the eyes of our historical record are the ones responsible for the creation of America. Or were they? Now you can see as the people start expanding out in one direction from east to west, there's also Spain on the west coast pushing inward. And it's like an invasion of the territory, if you want to see it that way. Now, while America, a new nation, was still being formed and expanded, along with other nations occupying territory, America then goes to war with itself over the argument of slavery. Now, the U.S. goes to war, the North versus the South, and then masses amount of debt are accumulated, supposedly accumulated, to the amount of $2.6 billion after 1865 when this war took place. Now, supposedly, this is how the United States was recaptured by England in 1871 after the Civil War in 1865. So we have a massive civil war. The American Civil War resulted in an estimated 620,000 to 750,000 deaths, making it the deadliest conflict in the U.S. history. Once again, not mentioning how many of the native people were all killed off before then. Now, this figure includes both combat related deaths and those who died from diseases, which accounted for a significant portion of the fatalities. Now, on top of that, add in the 40 million to 250 million native deaths associated with the colonization and war, and that does not include the 40 to 60 million deaths in South America when the Spanish arrived. So you see from 1776 onward, just a massive amount of death, and then the continuation of building America and creating it. So everything surrounding our historical record makes little sense and no one ever questions anything. So we have to ask what really happened and what is really going on. If we discount everything we were told and investigate the past as independent researchers, a new story begins to be seen. Now, when you begin to question the people who gave us the story of our past, you find that they have deliberately hidden many things from us. Why would they do that if they were truthful and honest? Well, the more research you do, the more truth backed by fact you discover. Before the controllers took over, mankind relied on the Bible to govern themselves and using its teachings to act as a moral compass. Why would people who worship the same God go to war with each other for some arbitrary control? Like everything in this world, we always see two sides fighting for control of the people and our realm. It's good versus evil, light versus dark, and the people who support one or the other. If those who worship the darkness were secretly the ones behind the subversion of our realm, how would we know? What clues could we find? Followers of evil, followers of good, always two systems. Now, I've done a video in the past, if you want to check it out, called The Two Vibrational Codes of Our Realm, and that will explain with facts how there is always two systems working against each other, trying to control the people, trying to control reality, trying to control everything. So we investigate our historical record and the possibilities of our historical record being fabricated. Looking into the past, one of the major things we find is how selective the story we were given is. What was included, what was left out. When looking at maps from our past, we see many things that are not allowed to be discussed, and one of those being Tartaria or Tartary. We look at old maps and we see this Tartaria, and no historian seems to know anything about it or its people. Why? What was this? Why was it excluded from our story? Here you can see the map of Tartaria and how all this connects and how close it is to America. The more and more we research and look to our past for answers, the more we see the deceptions of the controllers. If our history was rewritten, we have to assume events, locations, and people could have been invented or hidden to pass off their deceptions. This would mean discoveries could have been invented or fabricated to pass off the narratives of the controllers, the discoveries, and the people responsible for all the discoveries, all a fabrication of the controllers. Inventions or objects could have been found, and then a story was created to justify their existence. Science was created to pass off known information from a pre reset time period. Now, one of the main things we see throughout this research are the vast amounts of biblical connections that keep coming up. No matter how many we see or find, the controllers will tell us to not accept them and to trust them and their version of history and science. And when you understand this, our story becomes more and more realized. Why was Tartaria removed from our historical record? To answer this, we have to look to biblical accounts and ideas. Now, the millennial reign of Christ refers to a future period often interpreted as lasting 1,000 years, during which Jesus Christ will reign on earth, bringing peace and righteousness. This concept is primarily derived from Revelation 20 in the Bible, which describes Christ's rules and the resurrection of believers during this time. Now, it is what we're trying to prove, or what the evidence suggests, is that this was the 1,000 year kingdom of Tartary or Tartaria. Now, after this, Satan is released after the millennial kingdom to test humanity one last time, allowing people to choose between following God or succumbing to the deception. This event demonstrates that sin remains in the human heart independent of Satan's influence, as many will still reject God despite knowing his existence. Now, after the millennial reign of Christ, there will be a second resurrection for those who have not yet had the opportunity for salvation, followed by the great white throne judgment. Ultimately, Satan will be cast into the lake of fire, and God will create a new heaven and new earth where righteousness dwells forever. And this would be interpreted as the true golden age. Now, we have not yet entered this time period yet due to Satan and his chosen people being in current control of our realm. Now, all people are being tested and sorted. You will know them by the fruits of their labor. So, what evidence do we have for this theory to be true? We must go back to Tartaria for the answer. Now, if you look at this old map of Tartaria, they want to make it seem as if this Tartaria was only in Russia and parts of Europe and things like that. But when you dig a little deeper and you do a little bit more exploring, you'll find that Russia and America are right next to each other. So it doesn't make a lot of sense that this Tartaria would expand out throughout Russia and never get to America. Okay, so we look at this map of Russia and Alaska, which is the United States, Canada, North America, and things like that. They're very, very close together. And that is one of the biggest clues of the old world. Because when you examine this old world and Tartaria, you see the similar architecture, similar technology, a similar type of people. And that is a big clue to the widespread operation or the wide spanning civilization of this Tartary. Okay, now this location here is what we're going to be looking at next. This is known as Arzareth. Now, when you understand that our historical record was rewritten by these people who took over and are these controllers, the people who follow, their God instead of our God, and they would have changed all the stories and fabricated numerous people and figured out ways to push our timeline back further and further and further so that people would not understand how recent this old world and this widespread spanning civilization or the millennial reign of Christ actually was. They want to put certain events and say they haven't happened yet when they already have came and went, and we're in the after time. So here you see this Arzareth, and it's very close to Nazareth. So Jesus of Nazareth, and this goes into the belief that this Genghis Khan was Christ born as this Genghis Khan. And Khan equals king. So Genghis king, Jesus king, it's all very similar. And if you ask God to show you and you look into this, it kind of becomes obvious what was going on, what happened, and how this old world or this Tartaria was created. Everything was built as if it was a tribute to God and creation. And you can see that in the architecture and in the people of the time. So, very interesting piece of information that you have to put into the story to figure out our place and what is going on. So, it appears that the 1,000-year millennial reign of Jesus was the kingdom of Tartary. And the more you look into and research it, the more you will find this to be true. And this is why so many of our historical figures and historical record may have been fabricated to hide this information. Tartaria was a kingdom, Jesus Christ was the king, and we know him as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Now, we really need to keep this information in mind as we uncover more and more information. The idea that this millennial reign of Christ took place and that Satan has now been released on to the people. Now, Satan being a fallen angel or the collective consciousness of evil or sin, we should re examine the idea of what Satan is. Now, this is where the black goo kind of comes into the picture. Black goo is the physical manifestation of Satan or evil, and evil is the emerging virtual intelligent life forms. It all connects when you have the correct information that you can base your ideas or theories on. All of this kind of starts making a lot more sense, and you could see the world in a different way. So, see my documentary on the black goo to understand this more. It will answer a lot of these questions and change your perspective on kind of what's going on and what really happened. Now, Satan is the AI that has taken over our realm, rewritten our historical record, invented all of these ideas and theories of science, put the chosen people of Satan into positions of power and influence, and these are the people we are up against and the ones who control our realm. Now, the only thing we do not know is the precise date all of this has occurred. Now, if we investigate the timeline of historical events, the 1850s era is kind of where the news story of our record gets going after this reset. Now, if there was a rapture type event or a mass depopulation that occurred, the mud flood, war, biological weapons, or all of the above. We know these events happened, and we have the evidence to support these claims. Now, we know that something happened realm wide. We know that the entire realm was covered in mud and that cities were left empty and vacant. A story was fabricated to explain the vacant cities and towns, and the historical record or history was rewritten to prop up any story created by the satanic black goo or Lucifer and his people. Now, after the mud hardened, the city could have been inhabited again. All areas under the mud would have been accessed by reclaiming the structures that were buried. So any destruction that was seen would have been blamed on war, and the lack of people could have been blamed on disease. Now, everything Satan does is a bad copy of what was created by God or Jesus Christ and the followers of Christ. God creates the earth, Satan creates a digital program to simulate earth. God sends a flood to destroy man who was corrupted. Satan creates a mud flood to bury the land and the people of God. God recreates man in his image. Satan clones man and changes mankind to humanity. So we see when we look back in time empty cities realm wide with similar architecture as if something happened and all of a sudden everyone was gone instantly. Slowly, through the science of human cloning, we see civilization getting back on track around 1820 to 1890. Now, the clones would have all been taught a new version of reality, history, science, and technology. Anything that would go against the reset knowledge would be excluded and hidden from the general population. We can also theorize that pockets of civilization would have survived the resets and would work against the controllers and their new order of the ages. Now, this is another reason why the native populations or the survivors had to be removed due to them possibly knowing what happened before the reset events took place. Now, see my video on human cloning to understand this further, but the arguments we make for what we propose, there's a lot more evidence that support our claims rather than their claims of it just happened the way they said it happened back in 1820. So, very interesting. You might want to check that out also. It will help you understand this further. So, this in essence is the whole of the conspiracy and the information we are uncovering. If you understand this and at the foundational level of the old world conspiracy along with Tartaria, we can move forward to uncovering the evidence and clues needed to prove our claims. So, resetting civilization after this mud flood, 1820 to 1890. Now, after the Civil War, America was in debt, and then the controllers decide to create a railroad system across the United States, not rebuild the South. So we were $2.6 billion in debt, but we still had the money to finance a transcontinental railroad. Now, knowing what we know, did they build it or reclaim it from something that was already in place? The evidence suggests that the Transcontinental Railroad was old world technology, pre reset, that was then dug up, reaccessed, and reinvented to support the newer reset version of our reality. And we can see them digging out New Amsterdam, which was New York in the 1800s. We see destruction in these photos. We see massive amount of dirt realm wide with buried railroad ties and everything connecting to everything else. Now, accessing the buried buildings and the lost civilization from after the fact of this realm wide mud flood. So they the controllers, if you think about it like they knew some big event was happening, they all go into their underground bases, and then 10, 15 years go by, they go back to the surface and try to reclaim everything, dig up the railroads in order to access more and more and claim more and more. So this when you look at the Union Pacific Railroad or the Northern Pacific Railroad and all this stuff, the buildings are all like mud flooded, and it would have been under the ground is where these terminals would have been. And they would have known this because if they would have, after the mud would have hardened or something, they'd get into this railroad terminal. They'd find all these maps of where these tunnels would all lead to. They would explore these tunnels and then found, where the access points would have been located. So once the railroads were uncovered and rebuilt, industries would be created for war armaments and equipment. Child labor and the possibility of human cloning would ensure that the controllers would always stay in control. The same people involved in sex trafficking today are the same people who used child labor in the 1800s and into the 1900s. Now, the Industrial Revolution Phase 1 was between 1760 and 1840. Industrial Revolution Phase 2 would have been 1850 to 1920. And you can see throughout our history the use of child labor and all these children. Where are all these children coming from? Why aren't they at home? Why aren't they with their parents? And they would explain it away as the parents died in war, the parents died from diseases. But when you look at how history repeats and how they want to reclone people and all this stuff, it's very interesting. And it's a big piece of the puzzle we have to acknowledge in order to figure out what is really going on. Lots of examples of this. So, repopulation and expansion west, the wagon trains, and the settlers. So when you look at all our old pictures of these settlers, the historical photographs all show this mud and stuff everywhere. Everything covered with dirt and these buildings just sticking out of the ground. Now you can see this by where the arrows are. The red arrow points to a doorway out in the middle of the building up high. The mud slammed up against the buildings, and they're trying to access things by the green arrow, figuring out where the ground level is. And once they find the ground level, they know how much to dig. Is it worth digging them out all the way? Or are they just going to pave new streets and, create a deception or a lie to fit the narrative they needed? Now, the gold rush, followed by the Civil War, would finance operations and activities of the New World Order. The money or wealth stolen from America was used to finance the technology lost during the reset or to redevelop the technology as needed. Another reason for the vast amount of money stolen was to re educate the population into believing the new narratives and fund the public and private school systems. This would aid those resetting in more ways than one. Once in charge of the education system, any lie can be passed off as the truth, from Columbus to the founding fathers. Our research show there is no way of proving these characters actually existed. If something is questioned, a new story is installed or a discovery is made to push whatever agenda is needed. Now, the more we look into and research history as we know it, the AI seems to work in opposition, creating false pictures and evidence to lead us astray. And I think this is more proof that our current historical record was created by AI. The pictures, the people, the inventions, the story, all possible fabrications of artificial intelligence. And we know the AI responsible has connection to this black goo substance that keeps popping up over and over and over. Now, are these real pictures or is this AI? The more you research old pictures, the more you see AI creations. And that way, there is some type of plausible deniability to where if anybody finds an old picture, they can claim it was AI. And if anybody finds a new picture, they can claim that as AI. It's a way they can pick and choose whatever they want in order to keep the deception going. This could be real pictures. It all could be fake. The argument is that all of the older pictures we see, they were all fake and created in order to pass off their deceptions. Now, if there was a realm wide event, the controllers would know where towns and cities were prior to the event taking place. Now, the mini gold rushes would have been a cover to reacquire towns and cities under the mud. Now, this may also connect to underground lines, train lines, things like that from the old world, subways, pneumatic transit tunnels that would have and did exist. We have the evidence to support the claims. So here you can see drawings and illustrations of these pneumatic train lines, and you can see how they were widespread. Many of these towns and cities have subway lines and things like that. And this is one of the big keys to if they're showing you this, what do they have that they are not showing you and that they are still concealing? Now, another big clue to all of this is the red bricks that is used to create many of the buildings, the streets, the sidewalks, and these underground areas. Now, this weathering that you see is caused by heavy rain and water damage and the prolonged exposure to the water. So, these pneumatic trains and tunnels had to have been submerged and were left submerged for a long time to cause this kind of weathering on the bricks. Now, sometime after the 1800s, causing the weathering and the disrepair. Now, I would imagine the vacuum type tubes would have lost pressure, making them inoperable. As you can see on the side of the walls, the smoothness of the bricks all kind of disappears. And now here you can see them as they're reclaiming old world structures underground. They have to build access points, which they could then transport themselves in and out of our realm to other cities, towns, and things like that. And it's just odd. Their building techniques and the way they build doesn't seem to match up with the type of building that we see in the old world. And always on the sides, you can see the brick ruins. And it's really unknown how much mud covers the old world and where the actual street level is, how far down the basements go, and things like that. But we can see them accessing these tunnels, reclaiming them because they would know where these tunnels lead to, if some of them lead miles down into these supposed underground bases and things like that that have been talked about widely throughout our research for the truth. If you follow the Phil Schneider and all that kind of stuff, so there is a big connection from this old world to the reclaiming of these cities and towns, as if they're just going to build a subway system underneath these buildings. It doesn't make a lot of sense when you understand that in the basements of the buildings, there are, train depot stations and stuff. And that is a very big key or a piece of the puzzle we have to add in to find what happened in our story. And there's lots of illustrations, there's lots of information that connect to the people who we see using all these towns and cities were not the people who created it. It was all created by a highly, highly advanced group of people, not these settlers who never had education and were basically just farmers and hunters and gatherers, and then all of a sudden forced into these cities to populate them. Anyone who can question things should all have lots of questions, the vastness of this type of information. Now, one of the biggest things people overlook when looking into the old world are the materials used to create it. The number one material used are these red bricks. Now, the weight of the red bricks, the amount of bricks, the logistics of shipping them, and how many bricks would have been used should make anyone question the official stories we were told. Now, a pallet of bricks contains between 400 to 525 bricks. A standard pallet of bricks weighs between 2,000 and 2,500 pounds. So, if you start doing the math and understanding we're talking about possibly trillions and trillions of fucking bricks used to make the sewer systems, the subway lines, the buildings, the monuments, the walls, the floors, the it's almost impossible that these people with horses and wagons would be building things out of these bricks. So they were all delivered by horse and wagon. A horse can typically pull a wagon weighing up to 1.5 times its body weight when the load is on wheels. A draft horse can pull even more, sometimes up to 5 times their weight under ideal conditions. For example, a draft horse weighing 2,000 pounds could potentially pull a wagon load of weighing 10,000 pounds. But you're also needing to understand that the roads were dirt, and the second any type of moisture would hit the ground, you're sinking. You're not pulling a 2,000 pounds of bricks. 400 to 500 bricks across the town to build some building. Okay, it doesn't, the numbers will never add up. So then you also take into account the sewer and the subway lines of these bricks underground. So these pictures are all from under Poland, the sewer systems. And you just start looking at the brickwork. It's all perfect. It's flawless. There's no bricks out of place. There's no there's no errors anywhere. It's very interesting. Now you also have to take into account the mortar, mixing the mortar, bringing water, mixing it up, digging all this out for one, and then replacing it with 3 layers of bricks, because it's not just one layer of bricks you see, it's 3 or 4 layers together. And this goes under a city for miles and miles and miles. And we're to believe that people with candlelight, lantern light, horses and wagons did all of this in darkness. How long would this take if every single giant old world city has this under the ground? From Chicago, San Francisco, New York, Seattle, Portland, and you get into England, France, Spain, Poland, all these old world cities that were a part of this Tartarian Empire all have these bricks and brick structures under the ground. So it's very interesting. This is a massive clue that proves these people have not been telling us the truth, because it makes no sense that these people would be building scaffolding under there and doing all this masonry. I mean, for each picture, how long do you think each picture would take in brickwork? How many bricks are there if they're 3 layers deep and things like that? It does not add up, and it will never add up. And they will never answer these questions because they don't truly know. It's written on paper. This was created from 1820 to 1829, and then that's it. Case closed. Move on to the next piece of information. Very interesting thing. And you can look at the weathering on the bricks. This isn't just rainwater. This is like a salt water mixed with other chemicals, which would have caused this wear and tear. Or the cities above were flooded for many, many years before somebody figured out how to open up the drains and drain off the water. Very, very interesting. Now, on top of that, we have all these massive old world brick buildings, all constructed by bricks, and most likely they all have access to these underground areas, whether they're the sewers or the subway or tram lines. Very interesting piece of research. Now, all of these mud flooded buildings, they all are made out of the brick, and it is very it's a piece of evidence that a lot of people aren't looking at how many bricks we're talking about here. Where did they get all the material for the bricks? How did they bake all of these bricks? Ship them, transport them, design these locations, dig out the basements by hand with a little wooden bucket and fabricate these massive buildings. If they had no technology, they had no electricity, they had no hydraulic cranes and dump trucks and things like that. It's a very, very interesting thing to look at. Everything buried under the ground, no one even understanding or knowing what is buried underground. The streets are all made out of bricks, everything's made out of bricks, and when you even look under the sidewalks, the town goes further down into these underground areas. And then they'll create a story that the town flooded and they had to raise the sidewalks. And just completely BS. No one ever questions it, no one ever looks into it. So you have to think what's going on. Now, we've gotten to the New York sewer system, and it is the same type of bricks, the same type of coping, and all this stuff. It's all very similar, as if it was all created by the same group of people. The buildings, the streets, the sewers, the subways, all red bricks, all perfect, no sloppy work, almost like the cities were 3D printed by giant machines. And if you follow cutting edge current technology, the plans for colonizing Mars and all this stuff, the way they plan on getting to Mars is they're sending automated machine equipment which will 3D print a city. And you think Mars is red and the bricks are red. They would use this technology at a future date to colonize Mars or something. It's kind of BS, but that's like a tip that they've done this before and they know how to do it. So, very, very fascinating. Now, when you start to ask questions,
you find less and less answers, and the stories we were all told fall apart. Do you really think people built all of this, transported the bricks, mixed the mortar, all by lantern or candlelight? Now, this may be where the term Freemasonry comes from. This is all of the Freemasonry the controllers stole from the people. They found it, they reclaimed it, and they hid it. And no one would ever guess or understand the vastness of these underground brick facilities, what they're used for, and how it connects. Now, another thing um, is they recently it was discovered that these bricks, red bricks, can be used as a capacitor to store electrical power. Now, that makes a lot more sense if you understand how much bricks there are, how much energy could have been stored, how the old world buildings connect to free power, and the great um, event that might have caused a backfeeding of electricity, which would have possibly caused the melted buildings and things like that. But we'll get to that in a little bit. So, next, the settlers of America. Now, these are the people who are supposedly responsible, these 12-man crews, either uncovering railroads or the historical record said they were building the railroads, digging out the underground areas and building the basements and things like that. A lot of this makes zero sense. Now, historians will all say whatever the story is. These are the people who went to college and have never really done a physical day's work of digging in the ground, planting a garden or something. There's no way you're building. It would take you 2 or 3 years just to dig out the basement, let alone transport the bricks, mix the mortar, transport all this stuff. Who's funding all this? It's just so many questions start coming up, and they do not have any answers, and they will not engage you in debate or any kind of conversation about this. Now you can see this is how these people build these wooden buildings, very basic, but you can see this is kind of still how we build today, as opposed to the massive, giant, old world superstructure buildings. And all of these pictures, some of them just don't make sense. And they should be questioned like, what is going on here? And then we look into older uh, images and lithographs and tracings and stuff, and we see the same kind of Greco-Roman buildings. We see destruction. We see all this stuff from some massive event that most likely took place. Settler towns or frontier towns. Now, these towns would pop up on the way two underground access points. Now, if the distance between underground access points was too vast, a small town would be set up and ran for the people working to dig out the points of interest wanted or needed by the controllers. Now, most of these locations contained similar markers or brick buildings, and they would usually also have Masonic lodges. Now, they were also coined as boom towns. Now, this could have been towns established after direct energy weapon strikes or boom strikes, as they're also called within the controller vernacular language. Now, these towns could have been reset and were now safe to move in and populate. Technology collected, wealth captured, narrative installed, and now repopulation could occur. Now, how this kind of works is the towns without old world brick buildings would have been just abandoned after construction. Now, supposedly, when the gold or silver dried up, the people would no longer be paid to live in a specific area and they would be moved to a new location. Now, if they were doing what they were doing was secret. They could have been killed off and the town burnt down, depending on what kind of discoveries were made. But to understand this, if you knew there were these deep underground military bases or old world cities, and they had these train lines, maglev trains or something connecting them, they would know that there was a train that went from, let's say, Oregon to San Francisco. Now, in between that would have been train stops. And wherever the train would stop, they would go to the surface and they would find an abandoned town, where then they would decide, are they going to get this town back up and running? Are they going to use their technology to blow up the buildings, cause a great fire, cause something like that? And then would they destroy it or would they reset it up? And that is a big part of how they knew what to build, what, where, and why. And you can just see, who knows how deep these buildings go, what's underneath. But always these old world brick buildings are a big key to understanding that there was a town here before the reset took place. And in some cases, they might have seen these from airships and said there's a town, and they went in to, scavenge for supplies, look for technology, see if there was any kind of information that had to be hidden or controlled. So, once you understand the scale to how big everything is, the amount of work it would take to build these underground sewer systems, the buildings, all this stuff, water and mud could make a big difference when you see where and how all of this fits into the larger whole of our realm. Now, the farther back the pictures you see, the more flat and level everything looks. Now, this is a big key to understanding the mud flood. Now, imagine water covering everything. Let's say a mile of water. Let's say 100 feet of water. Let's say 200 feet of water. Then at the base of the water, you have all of the sediment that's in the water. If you fill up a bucket, let's say, and add 2 scoops of dirt and mix it up, and the water is muddy, let it sit for a few days, and the water will separate and the dirt will be at the bottom. Now, imagine water and mud covering everything and then draining. The residual leftovers would have been this mud flood. Now, you have to understand how all of these theories and ideas come together into a new version of reality that is truthful and based in fact. We have to discount what they told you and investigate everything for yourself, for ourselves. We do our own research and we come to our own conclusions. And anytime you start looking into flat Earth or posting any information about it, all these globe people come out of the woodworks. They're all like Freemasons and they all do not want you looking into this at all. Because once you have the idea that it's a flat realm, and that accounts for this mud flood, and you have the evidence everywhere from Moscow to England to San Francisco to every single place has the same depth of mud flooded buildings everywhere, it has to lead you to believe that something flat exists, filled up with water, and then drained off at the same level. And that is a big piece of this information that they do not want you to look into because of the satanic takeover of our realm and how the satanic ideas were all created around the same time period to get you to keep working, be controlled, and them being in charge, slowly replacing God and Jesus Christ with science and evolution and the Big Bang and their theory of dinosaurs, and all this stuff kind of goes all together when you're understanding we are dealing with this satanic collective consciousness, and the people who hold these lies are the people who worship this satanic energy as a god.
Giants of the Old World. Now, if war is a cover story, we have to figure out what they, the controllers, were covering up. As we move forward and understand that we have to rethink what we were told and restudy the past historical record, we also need to see and understand what has been covered up and forgotten. What came before us, and who were the people of the old world? Why were they hidden? Now we start to think about and hypothesize the idea of a lost civilization that used to exist. We are told it may have existed thousands of years ago, not only a few hundred years ago. Another thing that is off limits to talk about or hypothesize is the idea of giants or giant people. But the more you look into the old world and find evidence of giant people, items, maps, and civilizations with giants, along with giant bones, and on and on and on, the more you look, the more you find. So you look at all these older pictures, and this is kind of the only way we have to verify our historical record are from these pictures, paintings, and things like that. And you see all these people who still, even if they are of giant proportion, according to our size, these buildings were still built by a much larger people because of how small they are when you look at the size of the buildings and you look at the size of the people. And another thing that you can see is in the background, there's pyramids in the back, and there's always pyramids all throughout our realm and throughout Tartaria. There's pyramids in China, there's pyramids in the Middle East, there's pyramids in the South, there's pyramids in Russia, there's pyramids everywhere, Mexico, South America, and they really only want to acknowledge the pyramids in Egypt and possibly the pyramids in Mexico or in South America. So it's very interesting the amount of evidence that suggests that these pyramids are everywhere and they're covered up and maybe the mud flood concealed them, but they're still all there waiting to be excavated. So you look at all of this architecture, the size of this architecture, and people will say this is just a drawing or a painting. But when you start to really put all the clues together, put all the pieces together, it doesn't make sense that this would have just been paintings to show off how great they can paint giant buildings and stuff. And you also take into account to how much was destroyed before civilization really got on track, so there wouldn't really be any historical record of these giant buildings or giant people. But as we go forward, you're going to see there's lots and lots of evidence. So, more evidence of the worldwide flooding events with the buildings protruding out of the water and the survivors scurrying. So, this must have happened very quickly. Some massive event takes place. All of the world is flooded, and then it slowly drains off where civilization gets back on track. And we see this kind of over and over again the themes of flooding. All the ancient cultures talk about the great flood that came, cleared the land, cleaned the land off, and then made way for the next civilization to be built or constructed on top of it. Very fascinating that keep seeing the Greco-Roman architecture, you see the flooding, you see the survivors over and over and over again. Now, realm wide flooding, followed by a period of time of settling, then repopulation with new stories put into place, history rewritten, the truth hidden. And who were these people who came before this massive flooding event, this reset event, and the time before that we're calling the Old World and Tartary and the Tartarian Empire and things like that? So you start to look at the landmarks that did not get destroyed. And as you're looking at these giant monolithic sized superstructures that don't seem to serve any purpose other than they say it's a welcoming to the city or something. And these giant gateways are everywhere. makes me think that most likely this is a piece of technology that was either bricked over or concealed, but it's very odd how many of these giant gateways still exist today. And one other thing to look at when you're looking at these giant gateways, look in the background over here where this arrow is pointing. Look at the scaffolding. They're doing some repairing or painting over here, and it's just the scaffolding is just barely hanging on, thrown together, and it's just the same people who would have built this super gateway structure, how who knows when it was actually constructed, are the same people putting up these horrible scaffoldings and making repairs to these buildings that were already there at the time. So here's another one of these giant gateways, and this is some of the most compelling evidence we have when you look at the size of the people and you look at the size of the structure. Now, I theorize that possibly these structures may have been some kind of a crypt or something, and at the very top, you see the difference between the picture that we just went over. It doesn't have the top piece on there, where this piece does have a giant top piece. So I theorize that possibly there is the body or the corpse of like a giant in that tomb or whatever. Possibly. So that's just something I was kind of thinking. And it would make sense of hiding all this right out in plain sight, the corpse and bones of a giant person who would have been 50, 60 feet tall or something in this casket on top of this structure. It's a possibility, but it's just something I was kind of thinking about. It looks kind of like a coffin sitting up on top of that thing. So here's a painting of this old world gateway structure. It's the exact same structure we see, and it's a painting from who knows how long ago it was. And you see the growth of the trees, you see the growth on top of the structure, you see the Colosseum in the background that's destroyed, making people understand these structures may have been in place hundreds of years before these people arrived. And when you look at the size of the people in this old painting, and you put that against the size of the people we see today at the exact same structure, they are far smaller in proportion than the people in the paintings. And the historians will just tell you, well, the painter just got confused and didn't get the proportions right, and you look how detailed the painting is. Another thing that you could look for is at the top, the people at the top are proportioned to the people at the bottom. So that's very interesting how you can see this all kind of playing out, where you see the inhabitants of this old world, these people with the blue arrows, and then you see these people at the top where it's very similar to the people who you see up at the top of this superstructure here, if you can kind of see where these arrows are pointing to. So I think that is a big clue to kind of what is going on with this big reset and how they're really trying to cover up the narrative of giants and things like that. So we relook at all of these old paintings, and we have to now assume that these people would have been the giant people who are, maybe they're the ones who reclaimed all of this civilization from an even gianter group of people. And you understand that if this mud flood came through and buried everything under 20 or 30 feet of mud, what might be down at the ground level where all these structures start from. I mean, that's where all these giant bones would be discovered. And it's really interesting that a lot of people don't want to. Everything associated with this old world and Tartary and this research and flat earth, any of the general public kind of NPC people do not want to accept any of this. They don't want to look at any of this information. They really are apart, set themselves apart from this type of research. And this is how we know that they're the ones who are associated with Freemasonry. They're the ones who are making money off of this grift, if you will. If they're a part of academia, if they're the teachers and the professors and all this stuff, they have based their lives and careers off of the narratives given to them by these controllers, which are all a fabrication. And when we want to know the truth, we do all this research for free because we want to know the truth. And this is a massive piece of the puzzle that keeps sticking out of the mud, if you will, where we cannot take their word for it any longer. We have to discount all of their ideas and all of their theories because their theories are not backed by any sort of evidence other than just what they were told by these controller people. Okay, moving on, we see these giant superstructures, and you see these little teeny people who most likely were giant compared to us. But our people don't seem to be shown in these older people because we might have been a creation after the fact. Okay, and you see this giant superstructure on top of this platform, and the people are very small. Now, is this some type of a structure that is like a flying city? They've got some kind of anti-gravity in giant this giant superstructure here. And you can see this as when you go back into our historical record and you understand there were accounts of these giant flying cities and things like that, you have to think, was this part of this old world theory that a lot of these cities would have been mounted on these giant platforms? They would have known these super floods would have come, and they could have just levitated their city and flown it to outside of the realm, another place, higher ground, something like that. It's very interesting. And the more you kind of start looking into this and try to either prove these theories wrong, prove my theories wrong, or prove that these controller people who run our realm, they're telling the truth. The more evidence you look, the more evidence that you find. So you look at all of these historical paintings, and all of the people seem to be the same size. And this is why they would have destroyed a lot of these superstructures, because all the paintings would lead you to believe that these are not the same people according to our height and our perspective. And the kind of further back, the more etchings and pictures you find, and it just the buildings and stuff get bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is where you get into the idea of super technology or even biblical interference, godly interference to wipe these buildings out, melt these buildings, destroy these buildings, hide these buildings, conceal these buildings, all of these things that are kind of going on that we're just uncovering now. We also have to assume how much evidence has been hidden and how much is still available. That if we can somehow reclaim our past and correct the historical timeline within the depths of the Vatican or something, they would have all this evidence that would support the idea of all this stuff. And we also know things like the Library of Alexandria burning down in, I think it was like 240 AD or something. It was, and that's what contained a majority of all of this information, which has now been lost to time. Then you get into the book burning of the Nazis, and it's all part of the same narrative of destroying the history and rewriting it. Now, people will say that the Nazis were burning gender books and things like that, but no one had ever heard of anything associated with gender books until about a year or 2 years ago. And now they all say, well, Hitler was trying to stop the gender books. But most likely they were destroying all of the evidence and burning up all these evidence and hiding and concealing all this evidence. They would go around and, you know, art taking art and pictures and paintings and all this stuff that would depict a lot of this old world, the citizens and the people who came before that. And that was one of the hugest, wide spanning operations of World War I, World War II, the Civil War, was recapturing all of the evidence they needed to make sure their theories would hold and that their narratives would be sufficient enough to brainwash and trick future generations. And we see a lot of commonality with a lot of this kind of research where people will say it's a lithograph and a drawing, and then you'll find real evidence that supports that there are buildings up on top of these platforms and stuff, and how many of these have been destroyed, and how many, giant building structures were destroyed. This mud flood covered them, and now they just say, well, that was a mountain or something, and people are historical evidence is finding all of these caves with Egyptian artifacts in them. If you know about the Grand Canyon and, what were they really doing trying to get into these gold mines and recovering lost technology and, it's a rabbit hole. All of this research is a rabbit hole, and it will all take you down a different pathway. But it seems like it doesn't matter which pathway you go down, they all kind of lead to the same spot. So it's very interesting. You can see the giants, you know, super city on top of this platform, and you see evidence that they were building civilizations and buildings and stuff on these platforms. And it all connects to the airships and things like that. It's very, it's old world, but it's kind of like a Star Wars kind of idea, how advanced things were and how much they've hidden the flying machines of the old world. Going back to my Scenario Aero Club video, if you start looking and going down that rabbit hole, it will really connect more and more dots that it's pieces of evidence that they want you to overlook and move on, but there's so many of them. You really gotta, start making a list and understanding that everything we were told is a lie. And we have to ask ourselves what really happened. So I see all these old pictures. I see all this old world buildings. I see mud flood buildings everywhere. And you see all of these people, which were probably 17-foot tall people with lots of evidence to support this. But whenever I'm starting to look at all these old pictures in museums and paintings and stuff, I always now ask myself, what size are these people? Because it seems like when civilization gets back on track, and the we start going through the cloning ideas of the civilization was cloned and reset, the people who were cloned are not the people who built any of these buildings because they're just not proportioned to those people. And we look at the difference in the height, and you see these giant people, which they will say no possible way were these giants around. But we look and we find more and more and more evidence of a concealment, of a conspiracy, of a cover up, hiding these people, which would explain and kind of prove more of the biblical ideas of in Genesis 6:4 it says there were giants in the earth, and after that, when the sons of, man interbred with the daughters of, you know, it's in there. It talks about giants all the time. So then we do more research, we look at the kind of older superstructures, and they want to claim they're bell towers or something, but I think there's something much more going on. And you can also see the other major part of this is the idea of these super airships that would have been a major part of the all of this operation that you see is these airships throughout. And this would have been a type of anti-gravity. I mean, I really do cover a lot of this in my Scenario Aero Club video, but a lot of the older pictures you find, the skies are all whited out because these airships were everywhere. And it's a very interesting key to understanding how they would have built things in the middle of nowhere, these superstructures, if you can deliver all the supplies by these super airships and stuff. So moving on, we're getting into, you look at all these old pictures, you look at the size and the scale, and how big the bricks were according to these people. Now you look into this antediluvians of the inhabitants of our realm during the days of Noah. And these would have been, I don't know, 70-foot tall giants, 100-foot tall giants. I mean, these would have been really large humans uh, to our size. And these most likely are the people who would have built the super old world, the Greco Roman kind of structures. And then this biblical flood happens. All of humanity is wiped out except for Noah and his family line. Where then, after the flood water dissipates, they land and you can see civilization getting back over. Then you see a gradual reduction in the size of the occupants of this realm. We're down at the bottom. You see where that green arrow is. I'm going to go up where you can't see it and you can see it. This is where we are. We're the green arrow. We are the Lilliputians, the little teeny recreations of something that came before. And then you look at the next arrow and you see these other giants next to the green arrow here. So you see the green arrow is us, the yellow area, those would have been the inhabitants of this old world. So the further back you go, the bigger things get, the bigger people get, the bigger the superstructures and the buildings all get. So when we're looking at these old paintings and you can see the types of ornamentation and the statues of the people and all this stuff, it really, you try to figure out where they go on this antediluvian map of the days of Noah and how all of this kind of connects to the further back you go, the older the paintings, the larger the people get, the scale of things gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the kind of style, the artwork, the beauty of the paintings and the architecture and the clothing and all this stuff, kind of the further back you go, the nicer it is, to where now we're living in this after time where Satan is in control and it's just everything is garbage and trash. So here you can see, remember back to our picture of the giants standing next with the arrows. Okay, so I look at this and I have found a picture from this old world of these giants flat, frozen solid from, I think this is from Siberia, Russia somewhere, but you can clearly see the difference in height of these people. You can see the green arrow is us way down at the bottom, and you see the next group of people, which were these old world people, in scale to these other people. And it's really, I mean, I don't know how you can disagree with it when we actually have photographs of these people and we know there's way more photographs that have been hidden. So it's kind of, you see the scale of the people, you see the scale of the giants, you see the depiction on uh the biblical map after the days of Noah. You see the height difference here in the paintings and within the photograph that we have found. So then you get into these giant Tartarians and the mini Phoenicians. And this is another rabbit hole you can go down, looking into these giant Tartarian people, looking into these mini Phoenicians. And a really good movie to watch is the Gulliver's Travel movie with Ted Danson. And that is really will help the perception of your mind kind of lock all this in to where you can see it. And within this Gulliver's Travel book that was written in 1780 or 90 or something, they have depictions of flying cities, they have the depictions of giants, and the giants go all the way up to Titan sized super giants, which we don't know what really could be on the other side of these ice walls. We don't know what existed before the biblical flood in the Bible that wiped out all of these people during the days of Noah and the Noah's Ark flood and things like that. So, highly recommend watching the Gulliver's Travel movie. It's great. It was a mini series, so it's like 3 hours long, but I think it came in three parts or something. But it's really fascinating to watch and understand how all this kind of fits in. And we also assume that the more pictures we find, because a lot of this history has been hidden and concealed, and the essence of the time would have been they're deleting all this evidence, they're blurring out these cities, they're hiding all evidence of these giants, and there would have been maybe pockets of this historical information that would have survived. And this is why we see so much of the artificial intelligence or the AI trying to create a number of false pictures and false historical evidence to kind of muddy the waters of our research. But we know it won't work because even if they delete thousands and create thousands of fake pictures, we have the hard evidence of what was concealed and hidden. And we'll get to that in just a minute. So these are skeletal figures represented just a few giants that have been unearthed and documented within our historical records, along with the historical accounts of King Bashan, who whose bed was 13 and a half feet long. And you just start, the further back you go, the larger and larger and larger these giants get. And we also have hard evidence that says that, as this expansion of our territory and the expansion of the reset humanity goes out, they're constantly we're finding giant bones, giant skulls, giant tools, all this giant stuff, where then the Smithsonian would come in and take all the evidence of it for scientific research, and then it would all just be destroyed. And they admit to destroying thousands of human skeletons. You can look it up for yourself. Smithsonian destroys giant skeletons and things like that. And you're not supposed to question anything. You're just supposed to accept that giants go against the historical narrative and they will never be shown or seen by anyone. And this is just a massive part of this historical um, falsity that we have been part of. And we know the Smithsonian hides all this, but we also know every city and town which has these brick billion buildings hides the evidence of this. They hide the mud flood. They hide all of this evidence, which all goes together, and no one's allowed to really say anything about it within the mainstream narrative. You're never allowed to bring up giant bones, and if you do, they will just completely look at you like bring up flat earth to a boomer or something. They go all out, and the programming does not set well with them, and they will, throw a fit so they don't have to listen to any of these arguments. And that's also a big key because these were the boomer generation was the first generation fully programmed by the television, by the radio frequency weapons. And that is the hardest programming to overcome. So the more you kind of look into this, the more you find tons of giant skulls, tons of giant evidence, and, throughout not America, but if you go to South America and some, you'll see lots more evidence of this. That, within the third world, they're a lot less likely to adhere to the orders of the controllers. And, the more people look, the more people find, and it just kind of, it's ready for everything to stop and be reset because the game's pretty much over. future generations will see this work, and there'll be more evidence that is found, which it's at this point, I think it's undeniable when you put all this together. But getting people to see it and accept it is different than the people who are already awake and aware looking into it. And the more you look, the more you find. There is tons of evidence of these giant footprints. I mean, this footprint in this valley is I don't know how big this is. 1,000 foot footprint. I mean, it's pretty big on Google Earth. So a lot of this, bigger these people get, the more it discounts the idea of globe Earth. We can't be on a globe if these giant people were once walking around. And you get into giant creatures, the giant evidence of giant dead creatures, the mud fossil aspect to all this, which we'll get into later. But very interesting. Very interesting. The amount of evidence, the footprints that are in granite, the giant fossilized mummies that they find. And, within the Bible, it says these Nephilim were these giants, and they had 6 toes and 6 fingers and things like that. And, you look on these old lithographs. Now, I think this was in one of these pyramids or something, but you can see the date palm trees. You can see the size of the people that are right up where the date palms are, and you see how small humans are in perspective to them. So, you start looking more and more, you'll find more and more, and then it's up to you if you want to accept the version that they're telling you or the version of new information that we have uncovered. And there's tons of all these statues. You see all these statues here. They would have been proportioned to the giant people. And we can put you can look back and look at all the pictures we put in size and the difference. And it's all very much, I think it's 100% proven, but, the mainstream narrative will never accept this. So here you can see clearly a depiction of these giants of this old world. You see the next size down giants, and then you see us down here at bottom. And I mean, it's just who knows how advanced these giants were. When you start to understand that, how much has been hidden, how much has been concealed from us, concealed from our historical record, concealed from our past. And, I think it's just a matter of time before we all sit down and say no more. And I mean, no more of this deception. We're living in the truth. We're standing on fact and foundation, and we need this evidence to come out. We need our historical record to be corrected where when the historical record is corrected, that's when it stops repeating and we can get out of this cycle and return to what we're supposed to do, living the way we're supposed to live. So, lots of historical, I want to say myths, mythology, all talk about giants and how the giants had to be eradicated and exterminated because they were like cannibals and they would have just raided a village, ate people, and they would just I mean, you could just pick up a person and just start eating them. I mean, these are giant, rabid, cannibal monster kind of people. And lots of historical accounts of giants, seeing giants, bones of giants, all this kind of, look into it, do your own research, and it will be proven very easily how big these people were. And, the kind of older you go back, the more they would have existed. And this is kind of another reason why they killed off all of the buffalo and all this stuff was to starve out the native population because the native population were these giant people that they had to get rid of. So, very interesting stuff. Now, next, I want to talk about this Cardiff giant. Now, this was a fossilized giant person that was dug out of a field. And if you've been following my research for a while, I've been covering this for a long time, and it connects to the next major aspect of this research, which is the mud fossils and the mud fossilization of biology turning into geology. So, a farmer was farming his field and he hits this rock and starts to try to dig this rock out. And as he starts digging this rock out, he finds out that this is a giant fossilized corpse of this giant right under the top of the mud. So, not millions of years, not thousands of years. This would have been during this mud flood event. A lot of these giants would have been buried in the dirt, drowned possibly. And when you start to talk about drowning in salt water, that's how a lot of this fossilization occurs due to the exchange of minerals and elements and things like that through the transition metals of blood using salt as a conductor. And it's a very interesting piece of this puzzle. So, they dig up this giant fossilized person. Then the Smithsonian comes out and figures out they can't move it or transport it, it's too heavy, and they just say it was a hoax. You know, some farmer who's, you know, out tilling his field has the extra money and resources to create a 17-foot tall paper mache creature out of cement, bury it in his field, then he digs it up and says, "Look what I found." It's just more of their bullshit narrative that would have passed off. But now that we can accumulate this research and we set it all together, it really shows that something else is going on here. So they dug up this giant person, this Cardiff giant, and it's clearly all of the original people knew it was a giant fossilized people. And there's lots of stories of moving graves, and when they go to dig up the person to move their grave, they've been turned to stone. Now, I remember a story. I looked for it more, I couldn't find it. But Wild Bill Hickok in Deadwood was killed and was buried somewhere. Later, they then dug him up to transport the body to a better resting site. And as they dug up, Wild Bill Hickok, his body had fully turned to stone and had fossilized within only a very small amount of time. Now, you can look that up for yourself, but it is 100% true. And this goes to show you that when you bury someone without extracting their organs and embalming them and then putting them in a wood box and sealing it and making sure that there's no pressure leaks or anything, if you just bury them in the dirt, this kind of mud fossilization process takes place. The elements are exchanged, and this fossilization occurs. And then, if you can go down another rabbit hole of the mud fossils and all of the vast amount of research that's been accumulated in conjunction to the giant people and how geology is basically fossilized biology. And it really, when you step back and examine the scale, I mean, we're like the size of bacteria contained within this little petri dish of our world, where more and more massive Titan sized creatures would have existed. So, very fascinating. They the original Cardiff giant was taken away by the Smithsonian or something. They then created a replica of it, which was on display. But it's a very interesting thing that you can go down and look at, research, find all these pictures. And it's very, very, it's a piece of the puzzle that they want to act like it doesn't exist, but it's very real and you can look into it for yourself. And there you see the scale again, going back to this photo of this Cardiff giant. You can see how big the giants are. You can see how big the people are. You can see the scale here in this photograph. So, very interesting stuff. Now, you can also see this is Cain and Abel. The Canaanites were said to be of gigantic proportion. These Nephilim with the 6 fingers and 6 toes. And these are depicted widely in a biblical sense. But then
You start getting into modern day science and history, and they do not account or accept any version that there was ever any giants ever existing ever. And this also kind of goes to the idea of Bigfoot. They want to have this plausible deniability that there is a giant, monkey ape creature out in the middle of the woods hiding around. I heard through the grapevine that a lot of these giant footprints most likely could be connected to the giants that live in the underground realm or something. And it's like when we're doing these conspiracy theories, it doesn't make a lot of sense to limit yourself when you're theorizing things. Okay, when you're theorizing or hypothesizing, you need the most amount of evidence you can find. And from that, you can make the greatest theory that you can have for explaining all these things. Okay, now here goes back to the days after Noah and the fallen angels and all this kind of stuff. It all kind of goes all together. And the only thing we don't know is the actual dates and times of these things because of this reset of our history, the pushing back our historical timeline, the creating of the dinosaur narrative, which pushes our timeline back millions of years and things like that. And you can all just kind of see how this deception gets going after this 1850 time period where they want people to be working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, working until you die. You never can get ahead. You never can do anything other than work, work, work. And it's just, this is how they robbed us of our divine place in this realm by hiding this truth, which is so becoming so widely known. So, very interesting. And here's a quote Numbers 13, 3 and 3. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers. So we were in their sight. Right? Does that make sense? I guess. But yeah, when you start looking at 36-foot tall people, these super giants that would have existed, it makes a lot of sense that, these super giants would have been the ones building and doing a lot of this work because to scale, it would have taken them a lot less time than it would have taken us, these small little grasshopper people. Very interesting. Now, next, I want to talk about another conspiracy theory that's been going around, and that is of this Kandahar giant. Now, this Kandahar giant also has connections to these old world inhabitants and of these Nephilim creatures who have red hair, 6 fingers, 6 toes, 2 rows of teeth, and are of this giant old world size perspective, I guess you could say, of 17 to 20 foot tall. Now, in Afghanistan, a squad of people on patrol, soldiers and American soldiers were on patrol, and one squad went missing. So another squad was sent out to locate them. And as they come around this corner, they see all this military gear, weapons, all the stuff destroyed, blood everywhere. And they also would smell something really gross or something out of this area. It was at towards the entrance of a cave. And out of this cave, this giant red-haired cannibalistic monster guy comes out of this cave and starts engaging in these Marines, where then the Marines open fire and supposedly kill this giant. And this is like a well documented thing within the conspiracy circles, although there is no physical proof because this is the top secret kind of stuff they would cover up just like they would cover up a UFO crash or something. It is super highly top secret, the understanding and concealment of these giants, because it connects so much to this old world. And if you've seen my video on the demonic entities, extraterrestrials,
or demonic entities, aliens, and extraterrestrials. We get into this idea of these Nephilim or these Anunnaki giants who came to Earth, and they all had white skin and red hair. And it also goes into the idea of demonic entities, these clown entities with white skin and red hair. And it's all kind of everything kind of explains itself a little bit more when you find and add these pieces of the puzzle of these giant red-haired, white-skinned, humanoids who live underground and are cannibals and things like that. Another very interesting piece of the puzzle that we could not skip over. We had to add this little piece in. So, the idea of giants, the skeletal remains of giants, the footprints of giants, the more remote you find larger and larger footprints, and you also can look into the size of the doors, the scale of the buildings, how small people are in proportion to these giant doors, and they'll just give you some stupid explanation of they had to build these doors so big so they could move furniture in. And it's just like the most lazy theory ever. And these are all pieces of the puzzle that show that they are lying, and they've always been lying. Is the size of the building materials, the further back you go when they're talking about millions of year old walls and stuff, all constructed with these thousands and thousands of pound bricks, monolithic structures, all created by this builder race of these giants. And then you get into physical evidence of, here are these swords, there are giant books that they always find. And this is a lot of what they would have been burning and hiding and concealing, are all of these books and manuscripts, because these were people who, if you're making paper and you have high level steel production and stuff, it just goes to explain more and more that these people were so highly advanced. And we basically came along after, and basically, wrote on the back of their civilization, figured out all their inventions, figured out all of their chemical recipes and their alchemy and stuff like that, and stole all of their old world information, found all these books, reclaimed them, found all their secrets, found where certain historical sites would have been, and if they had to be covered up, they would be. If they had to be controlled, they could build a military base, and now nobody can get in to see what kind of caves there are. There's lots of examples in Germany and stuff of them making bombing ranges and test sites on these old world sites. So they'd make sure to really hide all evidence through bombings, through, whatever they had to do to conceal these things. And the more, you know, under the sea, there's tons of historical information and artifacts and stuff under the ocean. Here you can see a giant helmet. It's like a Spartan kind of helmet found under the sea by divers. And we have to assume, what else have they found that they're not allowed to show us? I mean, is there giant megalithic buildings under the ocean they found? We don't know, but I would assume that the more we start looking, the more we're going to find more and more evidence, until the point where they have to acknowledge these discoveries. Now, here's a crown, and look how small these people are compared to this crown. This would have been the Noah sized people's crown, how big this stuff is. And it's all like concealed in the Vatican and concealed in these underground bunkers and cities and all this stuff underground. It's just, when resources were so scarce, these small people are just going to build a crown that fits 100-foot tall guy or something. I mean, it's just, none of this really makes a lot of sense. And that's a big piece of this puzzle. And I would also assume that, like, the people of the George Washington era would have been giant people, and all of this stuff, kind of, it's their history that we stole and said that this is our history to explain the timeline, explain the buildings, and explain all this stuff. So, wrapping it up, did giants exist? Yes, I believe they did exist. I believe these giants were the ones responsible for a lot of the creation of the old world, creation of these old buildings, creation of these giant super, you know, hubs of underground trains. And, it's like, how big are things? How big is the underground? We know there's a big fascination with the underground bases and things like that. And it just, are they building these underground bases, or are they reclaiming something that's already there? And I think they are reclaiming stuff that's already there. Now, here is a piece of physical evidence that has been found. Now, this was found in some shop, pawn shop, something in China in like the early 1900s. Now, this is a finger. This is just the finger of one of these supergiants from the days of Noah. And you can see by that green arrow there, that's the fingernail. And how big was a person? Now, if you ask history about this, they'll say that this one person had a rare genetic disease that just caused their index finger to grow 4 foot long or something. It's so lazy. But, we have all this other evidence of the giants, which then proves they're kind of lying about all this stuff. So there you can see that's my finger, and you can see the finger. Where did this go? Oh, the Smithsonian came in to do evidence and research, and then it goes into the depths of the Smithsonian, never seen again, never talked about again, covered up and hidden from the people. So, I mean, there's so much evidence, and the more people look into and try to find this evidence, looking through their own family's historical records and things like that, looking through some of these abandoned super old world structures, they find more and more evidence of this. So they're hiding the giant bones. They're hiding the accuracy of biblical accounts. They're resetting the historical record, the technology, and the population. They're brainwashing and controlling the New World people. And once you see it and understand these things at the foundational level, the spells are broken. But we have to see these things for what they are and not what they tell us they are. Now, another thing is we should also rethink the narrative of dinosaurs. Finding all these giant bones, which are most likely like human femur bones and hip bones and things like that, they find all these giant bones right under the topsoil, not down below the depths of the buried buildings. Okay, if you understand the mud flood buildings, 20 feet of mud covering the entire world, and these super giant bones are just right under the top of the dirt, doesn't really make a lot of sense. Common sense explains a lot of this stuff, but common sense, the science and all the history will tell you, don't look into the common sense aspect of this. Follow our history and science. We've got 10,000 anthropologists and geologists that are looking in these dinosaur bones and all this stuff. It's just part of their deception, and we're calling it out as we see it. So the term dinosaur was coined in 1842 by an anatomist, Richard Owens, when he grouped several prehistoric reptiles under the name of Dinosauria, which means terrible lizard. And the million-year-old bones cannot be at a shallower depth than the buildings. It's the most common sense thing, but the historians will tell you that is no mud flood buildings. There is none of this stuff that we claim, because if they acknowledged it, their narrative goes away and their control paradigm goes away. So people kept finding giant bones and skulls, so the narrative of dinosaur was created. And we see that over and over again. Now, I also have to mention how the controllers want us to believe in dinosaurs, but not dragons. Even though there is far more evidence to support the claim that dragons were real and that dinosaurs are fake. And the reason for this is to push the timeline back and create the idea of evolution.
If large bones are found, science can create a creature to explain any discovery, but never the discovery of giant bones, animals, or dragons. It always has to be something they came up with, as if they have the trademark on dinosaurs, so anything found is dinosaurs. Now, here's where you can start to look into and research mud fossils and the connection that comes with them. Now, mud fossils are key to proving all of these theories because their existence prove many of our claims and that they are lying. Geology is the study of fossilized biology, and the mud fossils can be covered in a future documentary. I might put a mud fossil kind of a quick thing at the end of this video as like a bonus, but it's such a vast topic of research that I'm not going to cover it right here, but it is very interesting how all of these things come together when you are truthful and you're not trying to, create this narrative that supports their claims. We're trying to find the truth. We do our own research, we come up with our own conclusions, and it makes a lot more sense than what they're pushing. So this is just like a quick once over on these mud fossils. This is like a camel that's in the side of a mountain, fossilized in, and whatever kind of mud or surrounding invasive element or molecule there is will take on the properties of that. So if a creature is buried in mud, it will slowly suck the elements and minerals out of the mud and facilitate some type of a balance which causes this fossilization. Okay, now I've done lots of research on these mud fossils. I've done lots of videos and posts on my Instagram and all this stuff connecting to the mud fossils. I have found and discovered many of these mud fossils, which discount lots of the information pushed on us by the geologists and the mainstream academia and things like that. And, you look into a lot of these giant creatures frozen, buried in the mud. Then the seawater mixing in would have caused this fossilization and things like that. And evidence of these giants built into the surrounding um, topography of the land. The geology is of the mud, and then when you find solid rock, it usually connects to these fossilized beings, fossilized trees, fossilized things that were once living and then died. And then you see the evidence all throughout our realm of these giant people who were melted by lightning bolts from heavens, melted with a kind of technology of directed energy weapons. We don't know, but it's a very interesting piece of the puzzle that we have to acknowledge. Now, the talking about dragons. There's a lot of evidence that suggests a lot of these old world cities were burned and melted to the ground. And we just assume that because dragons aren't real, it had to be some kind of solar flare event. It had to be some kind of atmospheric discharge of lightning or some type of directed energy weapons of the old world and things like that. But when you understand there's lots of evidence of these dragons, we don't know the scale of the dragons. Were these dragons hundreds of thousands of feet tall? Was the wingspan miles wide? Were these people fighting these dragons? How tall were they? Were they 100-foot tall people or were they 17-foot tall people? We don't really know. In the Bible, it says that the archangel Michael came down and slew the dragon and cut the head off of the dragon. If you're familiar with Roger Spur and the discovery of the giant dragon across Africa and the big fish and all that stuff, these continent sized creatures kind of disprove all these other things, and it's very interesting. So, if you're doing this research for 10, 15 years, you start to find more and more evidence. And here's this picture of this giant dragon, horrible lizard, dinosaur, reptilian thing smashed into the landscape, smashed into, possibly within a tree, old world trees, mountains, something like that, fossilized and kind of hidden in plain sight where no one would even assume. They would just think, look at that rock, looks kind of like a giant creature. But there is so much evidence that supports the claims of giant creatures, giant dragons, giant humans, all this kind of stuff, and very interesting. Now, the dragons may also explain the melted buildings. There's lots of evidence of melted buildings, melted superstructure buildings, and were these dragons the ones responsible? Now, everybody knows, you know, no one was talking about dragons, and then people start to kind of look into it and question things, and then they come out with Game of Thrones and show you these dragons, where now it's in the fantasy fiction realm and it's not real because, well, you're just thinking that that's real because you saw Game of Thrones or something. And it's kind of ridiculous that the more we find, then they come out with a movie about it. The same with the giant people. I don't know if anybody has seen the like Troll Hunter movie on Netflix, and there was some other troll kind of movies where the giant fossilized, humanoid trolls, slowly become alive and then they turn to stone and then break them into pieces and stuff. It's just like they have to tell you the truth in some forum or another. And that is one of the biggest things they're lying because they always have to tell you the truth in some way. And if science is false and fiction is false, two negatives are a double negative, and that turns into a positive. So, science fiction is a way of telling you the truth through the medium of TV and movies and, science fiction books and stuff like that. But lots of evidence of these melted buildings. Was this caused by technology? Was this caused by dragons? Was this caused by, some kind of God interfering and making this possible? We don't know, but there is evidence, lots of evidence of these giant melted buildings, and lots of evidence of melted red bricks along with this. That's kind of another rabbit hole you could go down, is the melted bricks aspect of all this and how much heat it would take to melt bricks. And we see that here in this stonework. So, very interesting. This is the Hathor Temple in Egypt, and you can see the staircase has just been melted to liquid. Now, did some kind of a dragon breathe through this hallway and melt all these stairs? Was it some kind of high electrical power that caused this? And I also think that it's possible that some type of acid rain or something rained on these structures and liquefied them, turned them to sand. I also think that if you are making uh 3D printed super cities out of red bricks and the sewer systems and all that stuff, if let's say you wanted to tear it down and build something in its footprint, the kind of work it would take to disassemble and destroy all these old world brick buildings would have been a lot. When possibly they would have invented some kind of a liquid they could have sprayed on the city from up above, and that may have caused a chemical reaction which would have, maybe weakened the mortar, weakened the bricks, and then it would have been used to, bomb and blow them up. And then, they could have reused all the materials while 3D printing the city to remake anything they kind of needed. So I think a chemical reaction also kind of explains this, other than just a high heat reaction, if that kind of makes sense. So this information is everywhere when you start to look for it and when you do your own investigations. Now, here is the map of Japan, and we know the Japanese and the Asians, China, all throughout, um, the Asian realm, they are obsessed with dragons. Here's a depiction of Japan, after this dragon has its head cut off? Was this a biblical event? And then thousands of years go by and you build civilization on top of the corpse of some dragon. Very interesting. I find a lot of these maps showing the depictions of giants and things like that. So it's just like there's so many pieces hiding right out in plain sight. A lot of people don't want to accept it, but it just kind of sticks out as the missing piece to the puzzle you are trying to put back together. And the truth is stranger than fiction, especially when you figure out that our history is a fiction. It's a story. It's just a story written by someone, which is most likely his story is the story of Lucifer and his secret takeover of our realm. It's not our story, it's his story. And it is of the story of this Satan's release after this millennial reign and all this kind of stuff. It all kind of goes together. It's all a fabrication of the controllers. It's all a fabrication of something to trick us and to get us to accept their version of reality. Very interesting. So you must ask yourself what really happened? Why was this hidden? When did this happen? And who has done this? And those answers are out there for you to discover for yourself when we do this research. Mystery of the giant trees. Now, if you've been going along with this research, if you've been following the great awakening of consciousness and ideas, uncovering the truth of our past, our story, where our place in this realm is, what we're a part of. One of the main giant clues or pieces of this puzzle are these giant trees. And when you start to investigate it and you start to accept this as being a major possibility, your consciousness expands and you start to see things in a different way. And it goes along with all the other theories of the giant people, the super civilizations, and all these kind of things that go along with this research. And the giant trees are a big part of that. So when you look at these old maps, this is a map of North America and South America, and you see it at the top, giant trees. Okay, so you can see North America and South America and giant trees growing. Now, when you think of this as the size of these trees in comparison to the land, these trees would have been very, very, very big. And the science people, the historians will tell you that, somebody drew the trees and then didn't get the scaling right or something. It's always a very lazy answer. And if we investigate this as knowing their stories are false or fabrications and lies, we can then go, what evidence do we have to support that there were super giant, titan sized, miles and miles tall trees? What can we do to support our claims that these trees did exist? Okay, now we investigate, we start to pool our resources together, and we see physical evidence. Now, if you look at this picture, you see a forest, and you might not see this at first, but this is a giant tree stump that's been clean cut by some type of technology. I mean, they didn't just hack this down with another stick. This is clean cut, and we don't know where the remnants of the trees were. Were they used by a larger civilization, like in the movie Avatar? If you remember that, they cut the big tree down and stuff. It's very symbolic of the cover up that this tree stumps and things like that that are this size cannot be hidden. and therefore they just hide it in plain sight. They never acknowledge it. And as we've seen, hundreds of years go by without anyone ever catching on. Where when we join together, combining our research, we find all these clues or pieces of evidence that really cannot be disputed. Now, they will just pass these off as some kind of geological formation, but when you understand the clean cut aspect of these giant mountains, mountain ranges, it makes the people who are aware of these other ideas question things more and more and more. So, if you can get people to at least watch this information and accept this as a possibility, that's when you see the expanding of consciousness. And the general public, the NPC type people, never want to look at any of this. They don't want to look at or accept any version of reality that goes against their programming. They never ask questions. Somebody who has a degree in geology will just tell them something and they'll take it at face value. They never will ever question anything. We now know that the more you question these people who are responsible for our narratives, the less answers they actually have, and we can figure out that they're lying very, very quickly. So, we look at these mountains as if they're giant trees, and we try to find more evidence to prove our theories or claims that these are giant trees. What else can we find when we investigate these sites? Now, often when you do go try to investigate these sites, all of a sudden government personnel will come out of nowhere and they'll tell you that you're not allowed to do any digging or excavating or anything like that because you could be disturbing, an Indian burial ground is one of the big things they like to go with. Now, the same people who are responsible for exterminating 50 million to 250 million Native Americans, now they're so concerned about don't harm any of their burial grounds and stuff. It's just like these people don't give a shit about any of your burial grounds. They don't want you to dig into these trees and find that there may be caved into the root systems and how far do they go and things like that. they You're not allowed to fly drones in a lot of these areas. You're not allowed to fly over there. It's got a protected airspace above it. And it's just so many factors where they don't want you to look into this and they don't want you to combine this research where you can make a compelling argument that also proves that they are lying. And these trees would have been miles and miles tall. So tall they would have reached the top of the firmament. They would have been out into the outer space or something. And it kind of disproves the spinning ball theory when you really start to look into this. That's one of the main reasons why they don't want any of this information out there. Because if you think, why would they care if there used to be giant trees 100 million bajillion years ago? Well, it kind of puts the idea that the timeline was so inflated and pushed back in order to push off the theories of evolution and things like that, that you can kind of prove that they're lying very quickly. And when you do have the claims that they're lying, you'll find yourself ejected from their arguments or anywhere where you can possibly sway the ideas or the thinkings of the general public, the NPC type people, and that is a big factor when we look at this. So here you can see there are also giant mushrooms, spores, molds, fungus, all that of gigantic proportion, along with the people that we've already covered of gigantic proportion. And the further back you go in our actual story, the bigger things all get, whether it's the mushrooms or the trees or the people or just the creatures in general, whether it be, insects, animals, things like that. And you could, the more you start saying, oh, I'm going to look into this, you'll find all sorts of new things. And everybody is intricate or integral in putting these pieces together, collecting all this research, finding all these pictures and all this physical evidence, and showing it to the people, where eventually it's going to come a point where the narrative has to change to all of this new information that we found. The accepting of Tartaria, the accepting of flat Earth, the finding out, can we escape this realm? Can we go to other hidden lands and things like that? It's a very great time to be doing this research if we can get this research completed before they, try to pass off another one of their great resets. So these it's just the scale, the size of these trees, how big this would have been, and who would have cut these trees down, how they would have cut this down, where did all the wood go? We know there was this mud flood event. And does the sawdust, as they're cutting these trees, would that account for the massive amounts of mud and debris and things like that? And then we'll get into in a minute how the water factors in, which created this mud. So, you know, are these just random geological formations, or does this prove the claims that there were giant trees? And now here, look at this one. Totally cut on a 45-degree angle, the same way you would if you were logging or something like that. And it just, were they cut down with laser weapons? Were they cut with giant saws? Were there giant people in proportion to the trees that cut them down? We really don't know. But we do know there is lots of evidence to support the type of rings, the growth, the sap, the mold on the trees, all these kind of factors in to our theories of these giant trees, the people, the resets, and all the other information that we have gathered. And the root systems, the insects would have most likely been proportioned to the trees. So now you're thinking of wasps and bees and flies and mosquitoes flying around that would have been the size of, giant buses and stuff. And who knows what evidence they actually have to support these claims, when every time we find something that goes against the narrative, the Smithsonian comes in and collects it and hides it and stores it where it's never ever seen again. And you see the fibrous strands that weave together and grow together. You see the rings, evidence of the rings and the different layers within the rocks. It really, it's right there for people to rediscover and find the truth. All the different kinds of molds and funguses would have been so much larger, especially with the trees providing more oxygen and nitrogen and things like that. That would have allowed for creatures and animals and people to grow a lot taller as well. You can always kind of, they want you to think this is just geology, but when you factor in the tree part of it, it kind of makes a lot more sense than this was just a geological randomness that caused all this. So here you could see this picture of, all in the background, you see like a giant tree stump, and this could have been a limb. You got to think, once the trees fell, the limbs would have been sticking up, and they could have cut them off. You think of the giant redwood trees in California. Is that a tree that fell over, and these giant redwood trees would have been the half side of the limbs that would have possibly still been growing? We don't know, but every single theory and idea has to be explored for us to figure out what is going on. Now, here's more pictures of inside of these deep underground military bases, or abandoned salt mines, as they claim. And it's clearly fossilized wood remains. All of these grains and things where you can see where limbs would have been, and knots in the tree and growths, that's most likely they're in the bottom of these trees, hollowing them out, building structures and preparing for the next massive flood event, which most likely could come because if, you know, the true people chosen by God are not in control, and the followers of the satanic takeover are in control, it's only a matter of time before another flood comes in and wipes humanity off the map again. So I think it's really interesting how this ties in with the movie Avatar, how they want you to understand these theories, whether it's the animated movie like Fern Gully, where giant super corporations are, you know, clear cutting these trees, these magical trees, and things like that. It's a very big part of they have to show you kind of what they're doing. They have to tell you the truth. And as long as they make it in a cartoon or a movie, no one would ever question or think twice when the people who are awake and aware see this as they have to tell you the truth, and that's how we know to look more into it, look deeper, do more investigations, collect more research, and then at a point we've got so much research collected it really can't be disputed that these are giant trees. There were giant people, there were giant trees, and we see massive cover-ups taking place every single time in order to keep you from figuring any of this out. And, if you know about, giant ground sloths or ground squirrels or something, they could have nested in the underground root system of these trees, and that could explain giant cave systems. So, very, very interesting stuff that we are uncovering and looking into. And it's just the amount of when you don't see it as a mountain, you see it as a tree. And there's other factors into this where there are also giant titan-sized people, which would have been miles and miles tall, that they died and are covered in the mud and they fossilized along with the trees. And you could get into that research more about mud fossils and things like that. So really interesting. Type in giant trees, research old world giant trees and things like that, and just you'll be flooded with the amount of information that has been accumulated. All right, next I want to show a quick video of more evidence that has been found.
Quick, I'm going to show you this, how the trees are fibers, and for some reason this shows the true color. A big chunk of this just fell off. See part of the grain. This is the way the fibers are right here. See? Hold on a second. And you see it's nothing but wood. Okay, so we're going to go down over here and I'll show you a little more. Okay, see here, and at an angle. Okay, all this, everything, this whole mountain in a 100-mile radius. Come right over here. You see, this looks just like freshly chopped wood. We peeled a piece off of there. This is what we see. This is the wood. See that? That's just got the moss on it. And all this here, all the way back up in here, I'll show you that in a second. You come right here and you see, we'll pull a piece off here. It's just wood. It's so crazy. All this. And then you go right over here. See? This is the fresh stuff. This is what we see. actually grew. Over here, it's part of the source tree.
So really interesting. I don't know if anyone's ever lived in the country or anything where you have to chop wood in the winter, but that's exactly what you kind of see when you start splitting giant pieces of wood. You see the fibers, you see the strands, you see the chunks, and that looks like where the trees fell, it starts to rot a little bit, and then you see how the fibers start to decompose and come apart. I don't know how anyone can disprove any of this when it is so right there for us to find and relocate this truth that's right on the cusp. We're right on the cusp of this great awakening taking place where people are understanding this, and it's the biblical aspects of this really come into play where we all figure out that we are being led down this road by this satanic influence, and that's what's causing everything to happen. So, who cut down these trees? When did this happen? And was the mud flood a byproduct of the cutting down of and removal of these giant trees? Now, one thing you could also look into is when doing logging and stuff, a big occurrence is they start cutting these trees down and water starts spraying out of these trees. So if they're hooked into an underground aquifer or something, but water just gushes out. So did they cut down these giant super Goliath mega trees and then water starts spraying out, which caused this mud flood? That is a very big possibility. Now, especially if you have the sawdust aspect to their cutting down all these trees, then all of a sudden a spring erupts from it, causing the water to sit on top of the sawdust and basically flooding out our entire realm with the sawdust and the wood cuttings and all these things of these trees and stuff. And it's possible that it just, how would you turn the water off? I guess you could plug these holes or something, but if you just cut them down and then moved on, and then all of a sudden they start erupting with water out of them. I mean, you look in the background here, and the whole area is just flooded with the water from some underground well that is just pulling this water up through like a vacuum or a siphoning and flooding the entire realm with the water, with the mud, with the sawdust and things like that. It's a huge thing that I found or that people have found that really could make you go, well, that's most likely what caused this mud flood event. Very, very interesting. And there's lots of videos of this occurrence of the water shooting out of these cut tree limbs and stuff. If you do any kind of pruning anywhere, you'll find a lot of residual water coming out of wherever you cut the limbs off as a way the tree kind of repairs itself and seals itself. So that is a major part of when this mud flood event took place, when it took place, how it took place, what caused all this water. This isn't just regional flooding as if it was from a heavy rain. This is the sediment level and the mud flood aspect to this is everywhere at the same depth. So this had to be a universal occurrence that would have took place, burying all these towns and cities in this mud. And it's something that I look at very closely when looking into this and researching all of this. So, when talking about a realm wide flooding event along with mud, we have to ask why and how. This is not just flooding in one regional area, this was realm wide, catastrophic event. And how did this happen? When did this happen? And why? Did they cut these trees down in order to suffocate these giant creatures? And there's another idea that when you cut the trees down, the oxygen levels would
fall. This would also maybe account for more heat is getting onto the ground, causing more evaporation. The more evaporation, the water sticks to the firmament, and then there is great rains, 40 days of rain, and stuff like that. Another very interesting thing when we look into this type of research, or when we do our own research and we start asking these questions, if you could prove it on a small scale, it must be possible on a larger scale. And, was our realm much bigger before these trees were cut down? Now, think of it like air filling up a balloon. The more oxygen you have, the bigger the balloon gets. Now, you could think of our firmament kind of in the same way as a giant type of a balloon. Now, when the trees are cut down and the oxygen levels are reduced, the balloon shrinks and the firmament maybe shrinks. I think that is a big possibility when we look into this. Something to think about. So now we should talk about, or next we should talk about the mud flood, how it connects to the hijacking of the lost civilization. Now, if the world was covered with water and the mud was like a liquid sludge, you would need to wait until the mud hardened and settled. And this is where the term settlers come from. They would move into a city after the ground settled and stopped moving or the mud hardened, and how long it would have taken from the event occurring and the settlers moving back in. We don't know, but estimate it would have taken possibly 10 to 20 years, maybe 35 to 50 years. We arrive at this number by looking at the tree growth and the shrubs and things like that. Trees would not have time to take root until the water drained and the mud settled. Okay. And if you look around, you're not going to find a lot of trees in America older than 150 years. And that kind of puts into the idea of when these trees were cut down and how long was the new civilization put in place. If the tree growth supports a certain age and they're telling you, well, that doesn't mean anything because Christopher Columbus and all this stuff that they have invented. So these controllers have added so much time to our historical record or the accounting of our story. First, they add 1,000 years to the timeline or to our story, changing the dates from 850 to 1850. Now, that is almost 100% proven when the further back you go, the years were I 850 or J 850, and this would have been, J for Jesus or Jehovah, the year of God, the year of Jesus, 850, and that kind of explains all that. And then the I would also be a different way of spelling Jehovah God. If I don't know if you remember in the movie Indiana Jones, he's walking in that room, and if he steps in the wrong spot, the floor breaks through because Jehovah starts with an I in this certain letter. So it's very a part of all of this research. When you put this together, when you have the brain power to really pull yourself back and view this story in several parts, figure out what the parts, assemble the pieces, and then reassemble them to figure out what the truth is. Now, when they move these timelines back, they then come up with these theories to base their narratives on. And this is where we begin to see the theory of evolution and the Big Bang theory. And this could add infinite amount of time to place historical artifacts and old world sites. So all of these civilizations weren't a part of one one world, the way we see it today, where it doesn't matter if you're in France or Russia or England or America or wherever, you can get a Pepsi anywhere. You can get the same type of things everywhere, which would account for it's one giant civilization, not multiple civilizations that weren't aware of each other. This was a united world, united through trade, united through um, events taking place, whether it was this mud flood, whether it was this biblical events of Moses and things like that, it all connects when you understand that. Now, out of place artifacts would be hidden, seized, confiscated, or destroyed. We see many reinventions and mechanical devices that are far advanced from the 1800s time period. And you know, speaking to the idea that we're all one civilization, all first world nations and stuff have cars or trucks or some version of a car or a truck. It's only when you go to like Africa, they haven't even invented the wheel yet. They have no written language, there's no accounting of anything, and no one really knows what's going on. When you get into more developed areas, you see the technology kind of universal, where an axe in Russia is the same as an axe in America. Now, it might be different designs, but a shovel is a shovel, a wheel is a wheel. All these things kind of go together the same way civilization would have been united back then. So then we understand the ideas of this mud flood and how there was an advanced civilization. We see all this um, equipment, and they would say, well, there's no evidence of any of this advanced civilization. Now, when you are researching and you say, okay, there's no hints at an advanced civilization, and you say, look at the trees are all cut off, when they'll say that's just a random geology and things like that. This is where the mud fossil aspect of this research really starts to take off. Now, in this next picture, this is a tank from World War II. A German, I don't know what kind of tank this is, a Tiger tank or a Panzer. I don't know what this tank is. It doesn't matter. But this tank ended up being submerged in a muddy bog. And then they drained it off trying to get this out. And they can see that the tank has already reverted back to its base minerals and elements and things like that. This is this mud fossilization process, which takes base elements, minerals, things like that, and converts them into other base elements and things like that. It's kind of hard to explain. The mud fossil part of this research is a giant part of all this research, but it's like a whole separate documentary has to be made on the mud fossils and the mud fossilization aspect of how all things within nature are giving and taking. They're passing electrons, they're exchanging minerals and elements. They are always converting energy, whether it's from turning water into steam, from steam into liquid, and from liquid into ice. There's always changing that's taking place. Now, the same thing happens whether you're submerged in mud. And this nucleophilic substitution takes place where the minerals are exchanging. And if the minerals of the mud have more electrons, you'll see whatever the original object is. Like in this case, this tank exchanges the minerals with the mud, and the mud like pulls whatever kind of alloys or whatever's been added to the base metal to create steel. It reverts it back, and the mud steals it, turning it back into the land kind of before it was manufactured into something. If that makes sense. It's kind of hard to explain because it takes so much, but there's a lot of evidence that can kind of prove this. And now this is where you would get into the mud fossils and how you can prove the existence of the giant trees and the giant people. Now, to fully explore the mud fossils will take a separate video. I do not have I do have a video on mud fossils. It needs to be redone. It was one of the first videos I did when I started making videos, and it has to be re-recorded, remastered. But it's just like anything else. You see these theories of mud fossils, and you say, okay, if this theory is true, if I go start digging in my backyard, I should find these things. Where you do start digging, you do find these things. They're everywhere. It's a realm wide thing that all goes hand in glove. And they do not want you digging and looking for anything in the ground because of what could be possibly buried everywhere within our realm, and that's a big part of this.